Okay, so good afternoon and welcome. My name is Adriana Galván. I am the co-executive director of the Center for the Developing Adolescent. I'm also the dean of undergraduate education at UCLA and a professor of psychology also at UCLA. We are thrilled that you're here to join us to talk about a topic that is very topical right now in February, love and adolescence. This year, this is our third one for the Center for the Developing Adolescent. This year, we're talking about what young people need to know and what they want to know about how to build healthy relationships. I think all of us on the panel today are versed in speaking with young people about something they care a lot about, and that is the relationships, both romantic and non-romantic, that they encounter during their lives and that take up a lot of their thinking. Just a little housekeeping before we begin. We will leave time for questions in the last 15 minutes of the webinar, and you can also add your questions through the Q&A function throughout the discussion, and we'll address them towards the end. We'll be recording this panel discussion, and we will have it available at the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent website after the session. Okay, so before I introduce our panelists, I will introduce what we are here to talk about today. We know that adolescence is a critical window of social emotional learning. We learn how to connect with and how to matter around people around us. Romantic relationships during these years offer particularly compelling opportunities to learn the foundations of what a relationship is about. And one of our panelists is an expert in thinking about how this happens both in person and online, and what happens when our relationships dissolve and how we can support young people when that happens. We know that young people are eager to learn about how to be in a relationship, but sometimes they may not have the skills or have the access to reliable information about the topic. Sex education in schools offers classes, but they don't usually talk about the emotions, for example, the feelings that come with being in a relationship and some of the questions that are challenging to answer. And advice from parents and peers and increasingly social media can be helpful sometimes, but sometimes it may be misguided or not offer the solutions that young people are looking for. And so today we thought we'd bring together people who have expertise, both professionally and from the lived experience perspective about these issues. So I will introduce our panelists. I'll give them an opportunity to say a little bit about themselves. We have Thao, who is an associate professor of psychology at Arizona State University. Szabo, he's a wellness director at the Geffen Academy at UCLA and a founding faculty member there. Namrata Poola is a member of our Youth Scientific Council on Adolescence, and she's also a psychology and sociology student at UCLA, and we're happy that she's here with us. So Thao, we'll start with you. Please say a little bit about yourself.
Yes, so yeah, I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University, and this year I'm on sabbatical at Stanford University, so I'm living the happy life this year. But in our lab, at Heart Lab at ASU, we've been studying couples for a long time, and we really study what's happening between them. And so, and we look at how they develop and what happens when the relationship ends. We relate it to their mental health and also to, you know, some of the more dangerous dynamics, such as digital dating abuse. So we look at the whole spectrum of adolescent romantic relationships, and we study these relationships in their daily lives, but also in the context of their friendships, because it's all happening on the stage, as we say it, during adolescence. And we also study their relationships with their parents. Yeah, we study them in person and online these days. So
wonderful. Well, thank you for being with us. Namrata, can you please give a little overview of who you are and how you can help us think about this?
Yeah, of course. I'm really happy to be here. I'm currently an undergraduate at UCLA, and I'm here to kind of just share my perspective, of course, as an adolescent and also an adolescent in the digital age and everything that comes with, especially with all the impact it has on our relationships. And I really appreciate the initiative to kind of bridge the conversation between adults and the science, as well as like our youth. So yeah, excited to get started in our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you. Ross?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a really exciting conversation. My background is actually in mental health. I ran the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign from 2002 to 2010, where we created the first large-scale mental health presentations for young people in the country. And then started a mental health curriculum company in 2013 And then in 2017, became a founding faculty member and wellness director at Geffen Academy at UCLA. It's a school for students grades 6 through 12. And my idea was, let's start a class where kids learn about mental health once a week, every week, as part of their education before they go to college. And then organically, we found that we couldn't talk about mental health without talking about relationships. So we started the conversation around consent and relationships in middle school. And then our 10th grade year at the school is just about healthy relationships and everything that goes into it. So my background is really in mental health advocacy and speaking and writing. But I've for the past 7 years been doing really like different classes on relationships.
Thank you, Ross. We're so appreciative that you're here. I know you have a large platform. Ross speaks at the White House and at state level, and so he really has a broad reach. But it is so important to think about how mental health isn't just a one-off, right? And neither is relationships. Speaking about relationships isn't just something that should happen once or once a year or something like that, but organically, as you mentioned, throughout the way that we support young people. Why don't we start at in the present day? And Namrata, can you give us some just thoughts about your experience as an adolescent and the world of romantic relationships, and how were you taught about romantic relationships, and what have you learned on your own?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to phrase the question, because I think a lot of it was self-taught, in the sense that there wasn't a lot of like adult conversation about like what it means to be in a relationship at a young age. And I don't know if it was like a hesitancy to kind of discuss the topic, or just like they didn't want to address it or know how to approach it. But yeah, I feel like a lot of my peers as well as myself were really mainly informed through media, whether that be like the TV shows or movies we watched, or also now social media. So of course that has come with like, it's helpful, but also can be very misguiding. And it's really easy to slip into that misinformation, or maybe a really harmful model of like what should be ideal for an adolescent relationship. And I think also in my experience from all the media we consumed, it's really an idea of, oh, it's really important to find someone or like to get in a relationship, but there's not as much of a discussion about how to be in a relationship or maintain that connection with someone. So I think it's really nice to hear about, your guys' research and perspectives on how that actually plays out, as well as like maybe how they dissolve as well.
Yeah. So there's a very clear goal of you should be in a relationship without probably much explanation about what the benefits are, what what's the value or why you should want to be in a relationship. And then what do you do with that? So where did you go when you had questions, or where do you go when you have questions?
Yeah, I think when I was younger, of course, it was mainly like looking towards the mainstream media. Whatever was on Disney Channel, honestly, it was my main go-to. As we got older, I think, we feel more comfortable going to peers and maybe trusted relatives about this, but still, I think there is like gaps in conversation about what we feel comfortable asking. You wouldn't necessarily go up to like, a relative and be like, oh, like, how do I be in a relationship with someone? It's more just about like taking note of like what's considered acceptable, or like what's like encouraged. Yeah.
And why do you think that is, that we don't look to our elders about relationship? Is it because their relationship seems so distant from the kinds of relationships that we're in, or because why? I mean, for everybody, why do we not learn for every other skill? We look to our elders, right? How did they do it? How did they get successfully into this career that I want to do, or this major, or whatever it is? But for relationships, we don't do that.
That's a really good question. I think one perspective I want to add is like definitely with the new age, there's a lot more diversity in the relationships that we see. Like, for instance, like a lot of my peers don't feel comfortable talking about any relationship that isn't heteronormative, or for instance, like maybe with like an interracial marriage or like interracial relationships, it might be difficult to bring up. But yeah, I would love to hear from more of you guys about what your perspective is.
Yeah, Ross, how do you talk about this with your students?
Well, I think that it comes to an issue of comfort and normalization. And I think part of the reason the background of mental health translated to healthy relationships was when I was first coming up, mental health was a taboo topic and nobody talked about it. And so the goal of the wellness program here is really like how do we make uncomfortable topics more comfortable?
Mhm.
What we have found is really just starting with their own personal history and like what they've gone through, what they've experienced, what they've seen. And then the purpose of the class is really just to have honest conversations. And so, I think there's a lot of parents on this today. And I think the most helpful thing you can do is really try and normalize those conversations from a young age. When you
Mhm.
get to the point where you're trying to have that conversation later in life, it's often uncomfortable because you haven't done it. And the reality is you as parents didn't do it with your parents.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Trying to figure out, how do I do it with my kid?
Yeah.
But it is important to have conversations around concepts, and that's what we do. We're not a therapy school, we're a public health school. So it's like, here's attachment theory, what do y'all think of this? Here,
Mhm.
love languages or ways to feel seen and heard, what do you think of this? Here is conflict resolution styles, or here's how the media influences relationships, what do you think? So that it's an inclusive conversation instead of a lecture.
I think you're right. And what you said early on is so important about having these conversations early, right? Maybe even before the relationships or those questions about relationships emerge. Because once you're in, once you're in the thick of it, maybe that's not the best time to start the conversation. But that is so pressing and top of mind. And I think that relates to some of the research that you've been doing, Thao, on early romantic relationships,
Yeah.
right? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I just wanted to quickly comment on the parent topic too, that it's awkward for parents themselves.
Yes.
But that's often what we hear, but also it's a natural time. Once these romantic relationships emerge, it's a natural time to also develop a lot of autonomy from your parents. So
Yeah.
it's just really hard to kind of like navigate that space with your parents when it's this like when you are in an intimate relationship and that's yours, right? So I think having these conversations early on and establish norms, exactly what Ross said and what Namrata indicated, is really, really important.
Because you also don't know how your parents going to react if they've never talked to you about their
No,
perceptions of relationships and healthy relationships
exactly.
and sex and all the things
Yes,
that you naturally feel uncomfortable about because
right.
it's new. Mhm.
Yeah, and it's also like what Namrata was also referring to. There's so much more diversity right now in terms of our identities and also who we like and the possibilities of different relationship formations or even just wanting to stay single.
Mhm.
That is much broader for parents, and then everything online. Right. So parents also feel kind of like that they don't know enough about it. And so I think that's also a space that we could help with more than we've been
Yeah.
doing. So
Yeah.
It also seems like humans are hardwired to talk about other people's relationships,
yes.
not their own. But this is actually a good tip for parents. So like, if you're worried about asking direct conversations about your kids' relationship, talk about the relationships they see.
Interesting. Yes.
What do you see happening? And hear their thoughts and perspectives on that. And then it's a better inroad to having
Yeah.
a conversation.
That's so
Because
fascinating. Yeah.
he
Go
loves
ahead.
to analyze or judge someone else's relationship.
Other relationships like in their school, or are you talking about like celebrities? What do you like
It
specific?
could be anything that parent is comfortable with.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That's what really matters. Is like a lot of times when adults are trying to have conversations with kids, there's no one who can read authenticity quicker than a teenager.
Yeah,
If you're
exactly.
awkward, they're gonna sense that awkwardness and be like, you don't even. They'll misjudge it though and be like, you don't even care. You're just doing this because you think you have to.
Right.
So it's important to be authentic.
Yeah. Performative isn't good. In any space, but in particular about talking about intimate things. Yeah, you're totally right. That's so funny. Okay, sorry, Thao, we got off topic, but what from your research, what have we learned about our early romantic relationships?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that we often don't realize, and it was definitely true for the scientific literature, in the beginning, like maybe 2 decades ago, we didn't think that these romantic relationships were that important. But we've made great strides. And we now know that they heavily impact adolescents' mood, mental health.
Mhm.
It's a time when, unfortunately, also digital dating violence or in-person dating violence emerges and kind of also increases. So we now know, okay, this is an important developmental period. And we are also now realizing that what we learn during this period carries forward to our future relationships and actually is pretty impactful. And so I think that's one important stride that we've made in the literature and becomes more acceptable. So it's not just adult relationships that are important, but it's also what young people do.
Yeah. And also, as Ross mentioned, there are a lot of parents on the call to think about not being dismissive about those early
Yes.
relationships, right? You know,
Yes.
puppy love, or when I was coming up, they
Yes.
would puppy love. It's not puppy love. It's really meaningful love that
Yes.
looks different than when you're maybe in college or an older adult, but it really is so impactful for later.
Yeah, it's highly emotional, right? So there's both
Maybe more emotional than
yeah,
it is
probably
later,
more
right? I would
emotional.
argue. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the joys of falling in love and matter to another person and being able to provide some care, and like those are different roles than teens had before with their parents and with their friends. But you know, that also increases vulnerability to things like betrayal of trust, breakups, and there's this tension between becoming more and more intimate and then also being more and more at risk for all of the pain that also comes with that. And I think what we're kind of trying to investigate is that this tension between a good and a bad is also really a great kind of landscape to learn, because it really promotes optimal learning of things like emotion regulation skills, cognitive reappraisal, or communication skills. How do you deal with conflict? You know, and how does it also affects adolescence identity. That's one of the core central themes that is important during that time. And so who are you in this world with while you're loving this other person is an important theme at that age. And, you know, things like who are you on your own and who are you together? So the tension between autonomy and yourself is so really, really important at that age.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Please say, go ahead. I'm asking your perspective on that. Go ahead.
I was like, I really want to echo that point, because I think another thing that I feel like I see a lot is, especially with early adolescent relationships, that gets lost. Like, it's so easy to lose the balance between who you are as an individual and who you are as like a couple or like with that other person. And I think, yeah, like Adriana, you mentioned, like we easily brush it off as like, oh, it's just their first relationship. But like, this is like a crucial model of like how to be with another person that we're developing. So it's really important to like recognize if that's like healthy or unhealthy, and like how to address it as well.
Exactly.
The thing that we always try to emphasize too is, you know, the second largest period of brain growth is between 12 and 25. And typically what happens during that time period is what sets you up for the rest of your life. Like, we have so many conversations here, especially with seniors, where I'm like, hey, you're about to make this huge transition into college. And a lot of people will be like, yeah, I'm going to reset in college. And I'm like, yeah, that's not a thing. Your brain actually carries the behaviors that you do now and exacerbates them. So if you procrastinate now, you're going to procrastinate more. If you are coping with substances now, you're actually going to use more. And so when you tie that to relationships, what I think is so critical is having conversations about like what codependency is and what a healthy relationship entails, because to the identity point, the identity they're forming right now about who they are in a relationship also gets exacerbated.
Yeah, exactly.
You and a secure attachment, all those things, they go into college and they're like, okay, this is who I am. But it, you know, the majority of young people in middle school or high school relationships don't have healthy relationships. They get cheated on. They have trust issues. They have insecurity about their body as they're going through puberty. And that's every gender. They have something else happen. And then that's what they carry forward. And so then the dysfunctional adult relationships have ties all the way back to middle school and high school, because that's to both of your points, that's where we formed our identity around who we are.
And that's why it's so important not to dismiss the romantic relationships and the identity around that, and how central it is to identity. And back to your point, Ross, earlier about mental health. And so can you speak a little bit about how creating healthy relationships and supporting our young people as they navigate, try to identify what it is for them, a healthy relationship, how that relates to their mental health?
Yeah, and let's not put the pressure on everyone needs to have a healthy relationship in middle school and high school, because
You know what? You're absolutely right, because sometimes they're not healthy and that's okay too, right? They're exciting and they're thrilling and the cheating and all of that. Like that kind of is part of what we're learning about. So
right.
go.
Yeah, that bar would be very high. The way we approach this is to just make sure they have a language and
Mhm.
definitions that they can use in a relationship so they understand what's actually happening. If you
Mhm.
think about the mental health piece, when even 20 years ago, when nobody was really talking about mental health, the language piece was an issue. You need to be able to see what's happening, what's going on, so that you can talk about it. So
Mhm.
this is why we focus so heavily on this is what consent is. This is what it means. And it's funny, every time we do that lesson, somebody always be like, what's with your liberal agenda? And I'm like, no, it's the law. I'm just
Yeah, exactly.
my opinion of what consent is. This is the actual law. I can't help you.
Yeah.
But that's why it's so important to identify different aspects of a relationship, like what type of relationship, codependent, independent, interdependent. Where do you come from? What were the ways you felt seen and loved when you were younger? What's important to you? Also keeping in mind that other people have ways that they like feeling seen and loved. What
Yeah.
is conflict resolution? What are the styles of conflict resolution? And just having those kinds of conversations, especially like, I think the lesson that we do that gets a lot of attention is we talk about the hormones and neurotransmitters and chemicals released during lust, attraction, and attachment.
Mhm.
So that when someone is going through that period where they're literally obsessed with another person, they understand why it's happening. And their friends understand why it's happening. And they're not going to lose friendships or do other things in it because they're just like, okay,
Yeah.
that's what they are. So that piece, I think, is more important than everyone having a healthy relationship. Like even
Mhm.
this morning, there was a middle school kid who asked a question. She asked, why do I feel the urge to have a child? I'm 14. And then we could talk about how estrogen at higher levels can influence impulses because the focus in most of the classes is on the boys and testosterone.
Yeah.
You're not getting that equal education about relationships because the gender roles in relationships are so strict that it's
Yeah.
important to address all of those sides.
Yeah. Exactly. And address about the very real intersection between biology and social constructs and the environment. All of these things come to a head when we talk about relationships and our attraction to other people and our bonding with other people. Namrata, what are we missing from our conversations with young people?
I think first of all, I'm really excited about like Ross, all your work, because I feel like if this existed like everywhere, that would be amazing.
I know. It's amazing work. Go sit in on his class. It's truly amazing and talk to the students about what they're learning in his class. I've been really inspired by it. Anyway, go on. So we'll talk about that offline.
Yeah, like this discussion is making me reflect on like my own like experience learning about everything. And I still remember like the very basic like 2-day instruction that we got about sex ed was like girls separated, boys separated. This is your period and this is testosterone. And like that was it.
Yeah.
And then I think we've came so far, obviously, if we have such programs today. But I think like of course the ongoing discussion, it would be interesting to learn how like the digital realm has impacted us, because I think like that's like probably 80% of a teenager's life now. So I think we're all like still learning. I don't expect like, oh, like someone needs to have the answer, but it's just interesting to evaluate where we're going and like how to address this whole new like landscape.
Agreed. And that's why Thao's research is so important in thinking about what's similar and what's different about the online space. So can you say a little bit about what we're missing from our conversations about the online romantic space, Thao?
Yeah, I think it's first of all, understanding what's happening, I think, and it develops so quickly. And I am learning a lot actually from my undergraduate and graduate students in my lab. I'm not that old, but when it comes to social media, I'm very old-fashioned, apparently. I do not understand all the nuances. But what we do understand, like one of my graduate students just published a fantastic paper in which we asked teenagers, young people, to imagine if your partner likes this Instagram picture of someone else, and how you would react to that. And just imagining it already like elicited a lot of feelings of jealousy and feeling upset. And so I think, and this is just realizing that this is just one tiny piece of an adolescent's day that already is very triggering, is I think really important also to realize that these are micro moments in which a lot is happening at the same time, cognitively, emotionally, and then also in their relationship. And so, and investigating, you know, in some ways, yes, we need to understand the differences within person and online. You know, social media has all these different characteristics that might make some things worse or better. I think that's important, but what I actually am more excited about is to really understand what's happening online and to understand what young people are thinking about this. And so we developed this methodology in which we ask young people and teens to upload, for example, their most stressful digital interaction of that day. And it's fascinating. I've learned so much by having them upload these screenshots, having them kind of explain what's going on, and then talking to my undergraduate students and trying to come up with a coding system of like, okay, what are we seeing here? What's happening? And yeah, it's been really eye-opening and realizing that these processes happening are quickly can escalate. And yeah, so I think that's one space that we're trying to really understand.
Do you find that they're so different from non-online relationship building?
Some of it, yes.
Mhm.
I think some of them. So one thing that is, we asked them not only about the stressful event of the day, but also something when they felt appreciated or loved. And it's heartwarming to see what they upload. It's all a public display of affection and a lot of emojis, a lot of you know, positive words. And so that's really impactful to show what you care about your partner and how you care about your partner, and then have that kind of display, but also affect your personal relationship with them. So that's the good part. And then there is also a lot of misunderstanding that happens because we're missing out on all of our interpersonal cues, right? And also timing. So when we are in conversation, there's turn taking. But when you do everything online and your partner doesn't respond for 45 minutes, that's a huge stressor for teens, especially if they went online and did something else in the meantime.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so these are some of the unique aspects about online. And I think also, you know, sharing some of these posts remain active. And so if we think about, for example, shaming your partner online, which is not so great, it also stays there. So it's a repetitive victimization that is less happening in person. And so I think these are some of the differences that make it, that could lead to benefits, but also risk at the same time.
Yeah, and as someone who cares about young people and their relationships, either as parents or educators or other caregivers, how can we support and how do we ask questions, maybe for all of you, that that will yield honest interaction and discussion about it? Right. So because I have a 13-year-old and I know he's starting to be interested in people and they're interested in him. And I don't want to put him on the spot, so to speak, but I'm desperate to know what he's thinking about all the new relationship building that is happening. How do I do that in a way that's non-threatening and just open to conversation?
So I will, if I can jump on that real quick.
Yeah.
I love what Ross said and what Namrata also confirmed, is having these conversations early so you establish norms. But then I think when we were talking, we started this conversation about why it's sometimes awkward between teens and their parents. I think a lot of that also has to do with timing. And so in the development of a relationship, there's just these different phases. One is like, oh my gosh, I like this person. I want to be with this person. How do I do that? You know, then talking about breakups during that time is not so helpful. So, you know, they will naturally ask these questions, maybe not to their parents, but they will talk about with their peers and other trusted adults. And then another time that is really salient to young people is, how do I make my partner happy is a big question that they have. How can I be a good partner?
Yeah.
Then those conversations are really important. And then by the time they're thinking about maybe breaking up or they've been broken up with, which is a very stressful period, those conversations about emotions and who you are really relevant at that period of time. So there is this natural kind of transgression through these phases, and different kind of topics that teens, I think, are interested in. And we're not always sensitive to where they're at in their process.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Rob?
modeling behavior is also really important. I think that's what's difficult. Parents are often in this role where they're split between they're being undersharing or oversharing.
Mhm.
The undersharer fears that if they say anything about their personal life, their kid's gonna like latch onto it and it's gonna be crippling, partly because they're an undersharer general in life. And then the oversharer just needs to rein it in. Like, you don't need to share all of that. And I think a lot of parents struggle in between that, but kids do need to see models of healthy relationships or models of healthy decision making.
Yeah.
And so if you're affectionate in your relationship and you have good communication and things like that, if you have dinner with your kids, even just like twice a week, if you are modeling, this is how we communicate, this is how we look at each other after a family, it's helpful. But the reality is most adult relationships are pretty complicated.
Mhm.
There's independence, there's autonomy, there's divorce, there's multiple divorces, there's breakups, there's all kinds of fights, things like that. And so that's why I think, to add on to that point, you don't have to have a perfect relationship to model behaviors of how to be seen and heard and understood and connected to. The challenge with trying to engage adolescents about this is, one, they may not actually know what to say or do. That's why some modeling behavior is okay. But two, it's okay to give them time. It's okay to introduce concepts. I think parents often feel so defeated because they're like, I tried this thing and it didn't work. So like,
Yeah.
I'll just move on to something else.
Yeah.
You do need to be persistent in modeling the kinds of conversations and behaviors that you want to talk about, especially when they're not talking, because it may not happen for a couple years until they're able to engage with that.
Exactly, especially when they're not talking. Namrata, can you tell us about that perspective? When I don't know if you have a relationship with your parents where you talk about these things, but sometimes you don't want to share, but you do want them to, you appreciate the input and the interest. What has been your experience there?
Yeah, I think like the most reassuring thing is like obviously to have a parent just be there available
Mhm.
when you reach out to them rather than them inserting yourself and like
Mhm.
kind of demanding information. So
Mhm.
I think like how Ross talked about just like emphasizing that they're like, a stable like person that you can talk to,
Yeah.
but not necessarily like giving up after like trying to talk to them once, like
Yeah.
just having that open line of communication, I think, is the most like reassuring. And that way, like when the adolescent is comfortable, of course they would feel more open to reaching out if they know that they're still there, like waiting to talk.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That person's not, it's kind of, I guess, establishing a relationship of non-judgment about whatever it is, and in particular about relationships in this context.
Yeah, and I think another thing is that I know we said like sometimes the adolescent doesn't know how to ask the question, and I think like same thing for the parents, they don't know how to approach the topic, but just mutually recognizing that like of course like we're both here to support each other and we're not here to judge. I think that's also important. And then that also helps bridge the gap when it's like, oh, I don't know everything about social media, but I just want to help you,
Yeah.
instead of just being like, oh, it's probably like instead of like trying to advise things that you should do, just like having that like understanding that we're both learning and we're both growing, I think is really helpful.
And I think that we learn a lot about relationships through trial and error, and that's the excitement about it, and that's what's challenging about it. And it's the same way with how parents learn about their new relationship with their adolescent through trial and error, right? It's a different relationship that happens once that person becomes an adolescent and is undergoing puberty and has their own interests. So that's what's tricky. But how can we as adults help young people learn from the experiences, both positive and negative, that they have in relationships? Right? Because when someone's going through a breakup, you just want to make them feel better. You know that they hurt and there's a sense of loss and grief, but saying, well, what are you going to learn from this? Probably isn't the best thing to say immediately, but how can we help them? 20, it doesn't have to take 20 years to learn from that relationship.
I think one of the most important things is for all parents is you can't fix your kids. So don't try to approach it from a place of I'm going to fix this.
Yeah.
Sit with them. Them in the heartache and the pain. Don't explain to them how they get out of it and everything else. Just sit with them and hold that space. You don't always have to have the answers. That first rejection is brutal. Because you don't have experience with it, right? That first rush of all the hormones and chemicals is also intense. So in that stage of adolescence where everything is intense, it's important to just sit with them and not always have all the answers, because a lot of teenagers know more than you do anyway. They already know more than you because they're teenagers and they feel that way. And so you just don't want to get in a situation where you're fighting someone while they're going through these extreme emotions. So sitting with them can actually be one of the best things.
Yeah, both in the positive and the negative, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that they're in love, that's exciting. That's great.
Right. And the thing we've talked about before too, Adriana, is one of the biggest things that helps the adolescent brain between 12 and 25 is touch. And it's a time where they're getting the least amount of touch. They don't want to hug their parents anymore. They're also not hugging their friends, especially young boys.
Yes.
And so this thing that's so critical to their brain maturing, they don't have. And it is okay to to not, obviously against consent, hug your kid, show that appreciation. There's this weird dynamic, and I've talked about it before, where 10th grade boys their energy is interesting. They are, and people don't call it that. They're openly flirting with me, asking for hugs, asking for all kinds of things. It's something I take responsibly, with a lot of boundaries and a lot of conversations, but it also speaks to their need of okay, I'm connecting. So what do I do here?
That's exactly right. Yeah, I know, Ross. I'm so happy that you remembered that conversation we had, but touch is so important. And I have a personal, just an interest in just thinking about what the adolescent brain finds rewarding. And it's all the typical things, social relationships and bonding. There's something very special about touch that happens during adolescence. And if you may start to notice that, especially adolescent girls are really interested in hugging each other when they see each other. Why is that? There's something very visceral about it, obviously. But we need to be responsive to what adolescents are interested in. I think as parents and educators, that's our role, right? Oh my gosh, we are at 10:41 and we want to leave time for questions. So I want to ask each of you one last question that is a little bit personal, so don't feel that you need to respond. But what is one thing, but I hope you do, what is one thing you wish you had known about romantic relationships in early adolescence?
I can go first.
Thank you.
Heartbreak. Oh my gosh, I wish I had known how painful it was going to be, and that life is still going on and it's not the end of the world.
Yes.
Even though I didn't want to hear that at the time, but I think I would have liked to have known it beforehand.
But would anything help? This is one of those things about trial.
Right. And also how to break up in a way that is respectful. I think that's also something you discover that you don't fit, but then what do you do, right? And that what would have been helpful? I think what would have been really helpful was information beforehand, just to know that it's part of life and it's part of relationships, and it's okay to discover who you are, what you like, who you like to be with, and so and that doesn't take away that the relationship was really special. In fact, the more special it was, the harder the breakup is going to be.
Right.
And that there is a long process of detachment afterwards, and it's going to have emotional but also physical impact because of missing out on the touch and of the support, and you had the special place in someone's life. So I think the ending of relationships and the start of life after, I think, is a really important topic that we haven't
I think
really.
that's right. And knowing that that person, because it really is grieving, right? You feel like they've cut you off. And even before social media, it seemed as though they totally forgot about you.
Right.
And maybe even amplified with social media when they can post things about other people or other things that they're doing. But they haven't forgotten about you necessarily. And that's just not what you feel in the moment. And it would be nice to know that.
But yeah, right now it's very painful if you're going through a breakup and you see your ex-partner at all the parties that you're not invited to. That's like
really
very
hard.
painful. So yeah.
It's very painful. What about you, Namrata?
Yeah, I think for me, I think it would be really helpful if I could go back and learn the importance of learning how to be with a person and not follow a model of like a relationship. Because I think like that's when we start out, like that's all we do is like, this is what I'm supposed to do. But rather than that, if we could learn how to be with the person, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think so. And what would that look like?
Honestly, with things like, Ross's like discussions with his students, I feel like
Yeah.
that would honestly be really helpful. And just also recognizing who we are as ourselves, like, and having a sense of identity before maybe we like try to merge with another person in a relationship is really key.
Yeah, I think building off of that is just patterns that run in families. Like 3 of my grandparents were alcoholics who were completely disassociated from their lives, who raised my parents to be disassociated, who then led to a really difficult pattern of codependency in really like the entire family tree. The entire family tree is codependent. And that's a lesson I've had to learn the hard way in my own adult life of undoing. But I think just having that conversation about what families are prone to. I come from a family of severe mental illness and addiction. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 16. I tried to kill myself when I was 17. But nobody talked about the tentacles of mental health into relationships and how if somebody goes through that much trauma as a teen, of course you're going to end up in codependent relationships. How would you not, right? So that's what I wish could have happened.
Yeah.
I was fortunate to have a dad who was emotional and expressive and communicative and did a lot of things, but we didn't start having those conversations until I was like 25, 28. He was capable of it younger. He just didn't know how. And I do think, males to have a really important role in this. And we have to find ways to help them be more comfortable talking about it because like even in my world, there are when I started at Geffen Academy, I was the only wellness director in the country. Now there's like 50 of us.
Wow.
I'm still the only male wellness director in the country.
Wow.
And so that's why I intentionally teach the healthy relationships class, because if we're going to normalize periods, if we're going to normalize these other things, that male voice is important. And so that's what I wish I could have had.
Completely agree. And you have normalized just speaking about it, which is really important. And you and I have spoken about that extensively. And also that development is the product of the past, the present, and the future, right? Right now we're talking about the present, which is adolescence, but that builds on the developmental history of each person that comes entwined with their family and the relationships they've had. And it's important to talk about it now because it's the foundation for the relationships they will have later with themselves, with people, with their work, all of the things. And so development isn't a snapshot. It's really a process. And so ignoring the importance of relationships is really a disservice to the development of that person, male, female, any of it. So thank you. I completely agree. So we are coming up on our time and we do have some questions, so I will read them. And if you have any things to offer about it, please do. One is there research about how culture, gender, and religion impacts dating and parents talking with youth?
I can speak to that. There is some, and we need much more. And so our work is mostly among Latino youth in Arizona, and we're starting to do some of this work, and there's been some work done before. Machismo is an important cultural, Marianismo is an important cultural value within those, within that culture, and seeing how that impacts relationships and things like conflict resolution is really important. We did find in a study that both girls and boys who valued machismo, that was associated with using more coercive tactics during conflict resolution. So that was one of the findings, but I think we need much more research on this topic, especially also like thinking about cultural competencies, ethnic racial identity development, feeling connected to your culture and how that plays out in interracial relationships, like Namrata was also talking about in the beginning, and also same-sex relationships, and yeah, all of it. There is not much on the intersection of all of these. So gender development, and then culture, and then also I think the last one was religion. So the intersection of all three, I don't think there are any studies on that. So but really important.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I was gonna add,
mhm.
sorry, just
No,
as a colloquial example, I feel like for like a lot of like ethnic and racial minorities, like, or especially for like my peers and like my community, there's like no discussion at all about like, this kind of like romantic relationships in adolescence from our like elders. And yet like immediately after adolescence, there's an expectation to kind of like enter into like a really serious relationship or even marriage.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, there's like a really like, yeah, there needs to be more discussion for sure.
I feel the exact same way. There's a disconnect between the expectations before and after a certain demarcation of development and milestones. Yeah, so the messaging isn't clear, and we can be helpful in that way.
Yeah.
There's another question about, this is a really interesting one. How to counsel young people who yearn for any relationship and never are successful in attracting a partner? Ross, maybe you have some thoughts about this.
Yeah, and I mean, that's happening a lot. I think the one thing we didn't mention is across the board, every age group. One thing I always try to do is not like single out teen relationships, because the things in adult relationships and teen relationships are actually really similar.
Yeah.
But this generation is having far less sex and far less relationships than any generation before it. And at the same time, now every generation is having far less sex and relationships than ever before. I think it's now 47% of adults are single, which is the new high. So this is happening more and more, where people are actually trying and wanting to connect, and they don't. When they're young, what's happening is they're trying it once, twice, three times. They're not having any luck, and they're just getting super frustrated. The old school advice of keep trying to do things that you're interested in, or doing things that will help you find similar interests with someone else, is really important. So if it's not happening at school, what's something you can join outside of school, whether it's sports related, extracurricular related, whatever it is. But also trying to help them understand that they're not defined by the rejection piece or the people who aren't connecting with them. That they're gonna have to keep trying and just trying to be themselves, so that they're not doing so much extra stuff that it's resulting in people not getting to know who they are.
Yeah, exactly. And that they're in a different context, and contexts change, right? So right now, high school may seem very important and small, but then there's an opportunity in college and grad school, or whatever else is in front of them. The last question we have time for is one asking about how to support the need for touch for adolescents in our schools. And Ross, you mentioned this, and as I mentioned before, I'm very interested in this. There's not so much research on this, on touch in adolescence, but what is a way that we can support that need or that interest among young people that is, within the context of consent and things like that?
What's kind of sad is ask young boys when they have been punished for young typical male behavior. A lot of boys have been banned from recess as young as age as young as first grade, or having that kind of rough and tumble play that is critical to their development. So the policy we have here is to allow things as long as it is consensual and it's not harmful. So there's a ton of goofiness in our hallways. There's a ton of playfulness, things like that, that, you know, from the outside eye could look a little like too much, but with the systems we built in, it's allowed, because if you discourage the kind of, from the developmental psychologist perspective, it's called rough and tumble play, and it can last into especially the late teens for boys. So it's to your point, Adriana, it's got to be consensual and it's got to not harm someone.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, we have one last question that I'll ask, and then we'll say goodbye, unfortunately. I'm the single parent of a lovely, quite sensitive 7-year-old boy. I struggle to find male role models and must typically handle everything on my own. Any recommendations on how to handle relationships or be a good supporter for his relationship development as he continues to grow?
So someone else.
That's a beautiful question.
It is.
About it.
I was just gonna say, shout out for asking that question in the first place. I think that's like a really like a mark of dedication. But yeah, you probably have like a more certified answer.
No, I agree. Thao, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I was going to say that, and it's something that we've mentioned before, Ross and Adriana, you both mentioned it, like what's happening during adolescence is not just a snapshot. It is a continuation of our early childhood and our family relationships. And so the fact that this question is asked, I think is very, very telling. And I think, yeah, I don't have a clear-cut answer. That's basically what so maybe Ross has one, but I think missing the male role model is one perspective, but having a healthy relationship with your child is a very important one.
Asking the question is already telling of that relationship. Yeah. Ross?
I agree with Thao. I think it's really important to be present and do everything you can. There are now other options. There are movies, there are shows that have positive male role models. There's a really great Instagram account called We Are Man Enough, and that's a Man Enough podcast, and it's a really beautiful in-depth analysis of men and what they go through and what's happening and why they act the way they do. So I do think it's really important to be authentic and have the connection you have, and then you're going to have to supplement the positive male role models in other ways that you can, because the reality is young males are suffering in ways that we haven't seen before, in a lot of different markers, and part of that is we need to be attuned with them and hear them and see what they need, but also give them the positive examples.
Ross, I think that's the topic of our next webinar, and I'll invite you back for that one as well, because I think it is really interesting. Well, we are up on time. Thank you all so much. This is wonderful. There have been requests for your email addresses. If you're okay with that, we will share them. This will be posted on our website on Center for the Developing Adolescent, and we really appreciate your time and insight. This has been a generative conversation. I appreciate it. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.